Hey guys, my name is Kiera and thank you for purchasing this course. This is the master class and we'll be going over from lessons chronologically, starting from Illustrator, going into logo illustration, and really moving on from there. A little bit about me. I've been doing branding for a couple of years now for some studios in Toronto, and now I'm really heavily into animation, and that's pretty much it. So all the classes in Logo Core you can watch anytime you want. They're always available. It's self-paced, there's homework included, so it's really up to you for how long you want each course to last and each section of the actual classes to go on for. If you want to spend a bit more time on animation, go for it before moving on to the next part, or even if you want to look back at the parts below that. If you ever have work you want some feedback on, let's say you have this crazy animation idea and you just don't know how to put it on paper, or you just want some feedback on your logos or how much to price a client, there is always this button right here, submit your work for feedback, and I'm always more than happy to assist you however I can. I should usually get back to you within the same day, no promises, but that should be usually okay. And I'm always here to give you, again, help for anything you need, if you don't understand a lesson, or again, if you just want to see what I think of your logo before sending it to a client. Feedback is really important in this industry, just because we always need that fresh pair of eyes to see what we did wrong or if we can do something better with our work, and it's a really good way to improve. So I encourage you to always dribble around some ideas with me and maybe I can help you out. So let's start off with actually what tools we're going to be using, how to use them, and just a really slow dive into the class. So we'll be using two tools mainly in this class. It's Photoshop and Illustrator. So let's do a quick roundabout of what the differences between those programs are. So with Photoshop, it's really a bitmap editor, meaning it's really meant for pixels that aren't gonna be enlarged, scaled, but mostly just cropped and edited. So what that means is that, let's say you take a picture on your iPhone or a Samsung, whatever, and that photo comes out. If you enlarge that photo, it starts to get blurry, and that's because Photoshop is resolution dependent. How you took the picture, that resolution you took it at, that's how that picture is always going to be. You can't scale it up, otherwise you're going to start losing the resolution. You can scale it down, of course, but once you scale down, you can't scale up. And this is Photoshop, and we can see here this is the regular UI, and here's what I mean when I say it's a bitmap editor. So at 100%, well, roughly, we see the number right here. The logo is pretty crisp. You don't see really any flaws or blurriness with it. And that's the resolution we set it at. When we actually went to File, New, and we set the resolution, the 500 pixels by 200 pixels. So that's what it's meant to be at. And if we start enlarging it, it's going to get blurry. And this is what I mean. So let's say I'm just going to start scrolling in. So at 400%, we already see these jagged lines come in. And that's no good. And if we start zooming in more and more, we see that this logo is defined by just a series of pixels. And if you're printing this out, let's say this was the original, but you really enlarged it for the client. If we're going to be printing this out, it's going to get really blurry. And for the client's sake, you don't want them to have blurry menus, blurry car wraps, and everything on their brand is just blurry. That's no good. So for this reason, we're going to be using Illustrator. Now, this is the same logo, except in Illustrator. And now, look what happens. We can zoom in, we can zoom in, we can zoom in, we can zoom in, and it still remains crisp. Because Illustrator is more of a math-based program. There aren't really any pixels. They're just points defined by curvatures, and you can set it at whatever resolution you like. And when you actually save it out as a PNG, you can choose any resolution that you can think of, and it'll be crisp and clean at that particular size. So again, if you're printing it for a business card or even for a plain wrap, it's always going to be crisp, and that's what we want at the end of the day. So we'll actually still be using both programs though, because even though Illustrator is great for creating these resizable graphics, you can't really send that graphic to a client that easily, because if they don't have Illustrator, they won't be able to open it up. So we'll still be able to bring our actual graphics into Illustrator and just save them out as PNGs, change the colors on them, slap them into t-shirt mockups, and really just play around from there. And I'll teach you that all as we go along in the course. What I want to quickly go over right now is just how to transfer those images from one program to the other. And it's not that hard. So let's say that we have this logo core and we did this in Illustrator. We can just select it, and I'm just clicking and dragging with just the regular indirect selection tool. We can just do Command C. Let's go to Photoshop, File, New, and it doesn't matter what we do here. Let's just do it 1000 pixels by 1000 pixels, which is fairly large, but not too small. Okay. We can do Command V, just to paste. And from here, we're going to have a couple of options, which is the small tricks I want to show you. So if we do it as a smart object, we're actually going to be pasting the Illustrator data. And what that means is that if we actually double click on the layer, it's going to go back into Illustrator and open up our logo. It's a bit white, so we can just quickly make a new layer. And don't worry, I'll show you all of this later on. We're just going to make a quick square just to show you that the logo does exist. Let's make it a bit dark. And there we go. So what just happened is that we copied this information into Photoshop. Photoshop understood that information as though linked it with Illustrator, and then we could reopen it back in Illustrator if we want to edit something. And then whatever edits we make here, it'll open back up Photoshop. And this is a really dynamic way of just transferring data temporarily. But let's say we want to take logo core and we want to change the colors on here to be purple. We can of course go back to Illustrator right over here. We can click on the core, or let's just quickly zoom in, select the core, not select the background, select the core. Let's give it just a random pink. That did not work. Let's just go from here. Let's get some swatches in here. And let's say we just make it yellow for now. If we save this in Photoshop, it'll pop up as this, even though we are missing an O there, just because I selected it rather quickly. And we can do it, of course, this way. But there's also another way, which once you do, you can't really go back. And that's when you actually paste it as pixels. And let's just go to File, New again. And let me paste in the logo, but this time as pixels. And now, if you notice, once you actually pasted this logo, if we start zooming in, it gets really blurry. And that's because we actually pasted it as a Photoshop, the way Photoshop reads documents or exports them. PNGs, JPGs, GIFs, and not as an Illustrator file, a vector format, which is resizable. So it's always important to keep these things in mind. So if you're, let's say, moving data, Illustrator to Photoshop, it's fine to paste as smart objects, find the size you want before, placing it on your shirt, but then you want to raster it to add a drop shadow to really solidify it and export it as a PNG. And if you want to go the other way around, that also works, because we can always take this logo, or more importantly, this logo, and we can just drag it into Illustrator. And there we go. We have the logo from Photoshop to Illustrator, but it's still in its crappy non-resizable format. So if you zoom in, it'll get blurry incredibly fast. But there are a few tricks to actually go around this. And what this means is that Illustrator has its own way of interpreting if it can guess how that vector file should be laid out. And I will go over this in the future, but because we want this to be vectors, since this isn't a vector-based program, Illustrator, we can try to image trace it. And it usually won't work out that well. I've only seen success with it if it's very basic icons like hearts or thumbs up icons or social media symbols. But let's try to trace it. And all I did was, again, click the logo, gonna hit on this little arrow, click high fidelity photo, and it didn't work. We can also try again with maybe a black and white, also didn't work. But let's say we can actually grab a quick heart icon. So let's just grab a heart icon. And this would be a PNG image, because this isn't from Illustrator, this is just a Photoshop, and we see that because it ends with a PNG. We can go into Illustrator, copy this image, and now if we image trace, you'll see that Illustrator actually guesses what this vector should be. So as though it almost converts the file for us. And then we can go back in, we can expand it, we can delete away these white areas, change this, let's say, to a blue. Again, have to select swatches. Let's just quickly choose this one. Now if we zoom in, you'll see that the edges never lose their sharpness. Though you'll see, just because Illustrator tried to guess what it's, it's trying to guess the actual shape of this thing, these points aren't too accurate, so you'd have to go in and delete them. But those are the basic ways of converting from one to the other, and what both programs have their strengths and weaknesses in. So hopefully you understand this part. As a recap, Illustrator is great for resizables, and Photoshop is great for actually doing those finite edits on those pixels, like color corrections, drop shadows, t-shirt mockups, and all that jazz. So I'll see you in the next lesson.